What is the latest picture on the ground?
Well, the protests have been spreading to many cities and towns. Now we see large protests in large cities, Tehran, Tabriz, Mashhad, Karaj, and also smaller towns across the country. It's larger in scope, it's growing in scope, and the number of people joining in the sort of radical chants that we're hearing from the people. And it really is showing how the society is a powder keg. The situation of the economy has been pretty bad for most Iranians. Inflation, prices, the devaluation of the Iranian currency, essentially the everyday life of middle class, working class Iranians is something that hasn't worked for them. And this is not the first time. We've seen protests time and again every few years. People take to the street and meet violent crackdown by the state, and their grievances are not addressed. So they go back to their homes, but it doesn't mean that the dissent has stopped. And so we're seeing a resurfacing of something that's been piling up as far as various economic, social, political grievances.
And are these protests primarily about the economics of the country, or do they also contain, we know that a while ago there were protests, particularly over the treatment of, Mahsa Amini and how women have been treated and all of that. Is it bleeding into that, or is it mainly about economics, or is it a kind of a meld of different things?
So the spark of it was a specific economic issue, which was the devaluation of the Iranian currency and also a removal of a specific subsidy that the government used to provide that would benefit small merchants. That's why we saw the protests start in the heart of Tehran Bazaar. But it quickly spread to various demographics, various economic classes, and it's no longer just the economy. All of this is also political. It's social, cultural, like you're saying, the women issue, all of that. But at the core of this is governance, is how the country is being run, which you can call it political when it comes to economy, social, cultural policies. But at the end of the day, we see the slogans are against the heart of the system, against the Islamic Republic. They're chanting death to the dictator, to the top person who is in power in the country, who they see as responsible for the current situation of their everyday life, which does include the situation of the economy, of social, cultural issues, but also political. And one factor that really highlights this anger in the masses is corruption, is the corruption in the country that has benefited an elite class. And people see that sort of divide in the society, that a minority has actually gotten richer and more powerful from this situation. It's not everyone going down. It's a minority who's benefited, and then the majority who's just getting, seeing this inflation, this worsening of their everyday life. And that just adds fuel to the anger of the masses.
And look, Negar, we're all watching this very closely. Of course, last night we were seeing lots of images coming out. There have been some kind of protests in Iran before, as I say, particularly around a lot of the cultural issues in terms of women. And there have been very, very harsh crackdowns. Do you think this uprising will be different? Do you think this will result in change? And what would that change be?
Well, one interesting difference that we've observed is that the crackdown has not been as severe as the past. This is partially, of course, there's a more moderate or reformist president in power, and his rhetoric and his government's rhetoric towards the protesters has been very different. They've publicly said, we want to listen to you, we want to hear you out. It's also a result of the post-war, the June war with Israel and the US, where I think they really realize that their legitimacy crisis can turn into an existential crisis, not just from the inside, but also from the outside. And they're trying to maybe repair that widening gap between state and society. So we haven't seen that iron fist crackdown yet that we had seen in past protests. And that looks like it's changing today and just yesterday with the internet and with the speeches of the supreme leader and also with the violence rising. But I think that sort of a fairly more moderate response in the crackdown also opened the space for more people to feel the courage to take to the street and come and show their protest and their anger. But that may also change. And then also if there's a foreign intervention in the form of a military intervention by Israel and the US, that can also be a wild card that can change things on the ground dramatically.
One of our listeners has messaged in, Nega, Lisa, saying, I don't think anyone will be sorry to see the back of the Ayatollah and the current regime. However, I would like to know what the plan is for the day after. The son of the last Shah would not be a realistic or acceptable option, and there doesn't seem to be any organised opposition. Or are they in hiding? What would you say to my listener, Lisa?
I agree. There isn't a very organized opposition because the regime hasn't allowed that. Anyone that has shown any sort of viable leadership, movement building capacity, any movement that was taking shape and form in the Iranian civil society, the system has very carefully and systematically tried to shut it down by arrests, imprisonment, house arrests, and just breaking up of these movements and networks. We have to remember this is a system that came out of a popular revolution itself. So they came out of a movement building sort of a social and popular phenomena, and they understand when those nodes start to form, and they kind of reverse engineered what helped them come to power to try to prevent it. And so that's why there is no viable opposition in a form of a organized large movement on the ground, because it hasn't been allowed. Although the Iranian civil society has been active, there are figures that are well respected. They just don't have a lot of power and a lot of reach for a big movement because they're not allowed to. Every time they speak up or trying to organize, they get arrested or put under house arrest. So yeah, there isn't really a viable sort of alternative if you completely get rid of the system. Now, when we talk about the foreign intervention, we have to see what the U.S. President Trump did in Venezuela. This is not sort of the model that a lot of people have seen in the past for Middle Eastern regimes, sort of a removal of the entirety. In Venezuela, it's just a decapitation. They remove the top person from the power and essentially are allowing the rest of the system to continue.
Is there any appetite in Iranian society for America to get involved?
I think part of the society, yes, we're seeing people really at their wits' end. You know, they just don't want to continue the status quo. That doesn't mean they see a viable alternative. It's just that they're saying it can't get any worse than what it is. And this is also the sentiment that people did feel. A lot of people before the 1979 revolution, they were saying it can't get any worse than this. I don't care what comes after. I just want this to end. And it didn't really get better. And you talk to many revolutionaries of the 79 era, and they're saying, yeah, I didn't realize it can actually get worse than what it was. So I think that's what makes part of the urban middle class, the more educated elite, a little careful and uncomfortable with the unknown, because they also look around in the neighborhood. They see their neighbors, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. You know, these foreign interventions with hard force didn't really bring that kind of peaceful democratic movements to a lot of these countries. So security, stability, and things not getting worse than they are is also a flip side, and the fear that's mostly in the minds of people who can afford to think that way, the middle classes, the urban classes, and people who are not really at their wits' end.
Well, look, really interesting speaking with you. Very, very good kind of overview. I think we've learned a lot from chatting to you. Thank you very much for your time. That's Nega Mortazavi.